Hi everyone, I'm Maya Morales and I'm doing Chapter 10. Chapter 10 focuses on adolescence. So, first, we're going to talk about the conceptual problems of adolescence. The term adolescence comes from the Latin verb adolescere, which means literally to grow up or to come to maturity. The concept of adolescence as a distinct period in the life cycle was not developed before the Industrial Revolution. The concept of adolescence has created its own reality, kind of like a self fulfilling prophecy. So you say that teenagers are rebellious, then you become a teenager and you feel like you have to do that. The earliest scientific study on adolescence was done by Stanley Hall, and Hall was strongly influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. He believed that we all recapitulate or relive the human history of evolution as we grow up. So the four stages that Hall suggests are the infancy stage, the childhood stage, the pre-adolescent stage, and the adolescent stage. Hall described the transitional stage towards maturity as a period of storm and stress. However, people generally support Margaret Mead's emphasis on sociocultural variability in adolescent stress rather than biogenetic universality. So Margaret Mead did the study with the Samoan girls, and she said that it was pretty easy for them to transition from puberty to like womanhood because of the sociocultural factors. And Hall is saying that no matter what your sociocultural factors, like biologically, it's storm and stress. So in some societies, puberty was marked by rites of passage like circumcision, tattooing, or menstruation ceremonies. And as soon as those puberty rites were over, you were an adult. So girls became women and boys became men. Now there's more gray area because we don't really, at least in our culture, see these rites of passage. So it's just like, are you an adult when you're 16, when you're 18, when you're 21? Like, there's just unknown. So another conceptual problem of adolescence is that the age at which puberty occurs varies widely. People hit puberty at all different ages. It's not like once you turn 13, that's puberty. Human growth is universal, but patterns of and problems in growth vary depending on social conditions and cultural forces. So some developmental aspects of adolescence are that from sociological and ethnological points of view, adolescence is the first major transitional period in role socialization. Roles are expected patterns of behaviors associated with one's status or position in society. So, sociologically speaking, adolescence is a crisis of role ambivalence. You're not a kid anymore, but you're not an adult, so you don't really know where you fit in. You're kind of lost. The question of who am I and what am I supposed to do is relevant. And Ruth Benedict identified three contrasts that occur in American culture between child and adult roles. So you go from non-responsible to responsible roles, from submission to dominance, and from sterile to fertile sex relations. Adolescents in industrialized societies don't typically have rites of passage. They experience like a decade-long gap of discontinuity before roles. So that's when you're in a child and adult, like what's the gray area? Societies with rites of passage use those rituals as a symbolic bridge between childhood and adulthood. So those children experience transition with continuity. They go right into one thing to another thing. So the adolescent subculture means the particular way of life among a certain group of people in a given society. So adolescent subculture is a complex phenomenon. Deviant behavior or rebellion against the parent culture can be a byproduct of the subculture. Hans Sebald suggests 8 important elements of a subculture. This is subcultures in general, not like specific to the adolescents. Relatively unique values and norms, in-group lingo, distinct channels of communication not shared with outsiders, unique styles or fads, a sense of solidarity, status criteria in terms of cognizing and adhering to them in peer relationships, influence and power of leaders enhancing the identity, gratification of specific needs that the larger social structure fails to provide. Romantic idealism is also something we really see. It appears to be one of the most common and important prerequisites for the adolescent subculture specifically. So, romanticism and idealism affect self perception, interpersonal relationships, outlook on life, moral and ethical judgment, political involvement, and worldview. Idealistic worldview is mainly a characteristic of middle class youth in the modern world because we're kind of privileged enough to do that. We're not so focused on just like surviving. Generally, we're sheltered from the harsh reality of making a living, but tend to be critical of adults, parents, for being materialistic. The counterculture movement in the 1960s included two strong contrasting modes of youth subculture, which was hippie culture and then like revolutionary culture. Hippie culture was a passive mode of the counterculture. They were committed to change the society by giving their time and labor without seeking personal gain. Engaged in political confrontations with public demonstrations like sit-ins or boycotts. And whether the hippie or the radical, both subcultures had a common base, the romantic idealization of liberation, humanism, and altruism. Countercultures have been considered phenomena amongst middle class youth. Delinquent subcultures have been attributed to lower class youth. So, smoking weed could be considered counterculture or delinquent subculture depending on the class. Miller suggests 5 focal concerns of the lower class that are associated with delinquent culture, and those are trouble, toughness, smartness, excitement, and fate. So these aren't unique to the lower class, and they could be shared with the middle class, and exposure to them doesn't necessarily mean that you will become a delinquent. It's just that these are usually found in delinquency. Adolescent stress. So stress is a mismatch, actual or perceived, between the person and his or her environment. So too much challenge can overwhelm, and too little will bore a person. There's also problems with solitude. So 1/4 of time is spent alone by adolescents, and many cultures, daily solitude amongst teenagers is considered unnatural. Many teenagers feel worse when they're alone. There's more feelings of loneliness, detachment, and boredom. There's also problems in family. So usually adolescents are heavily dependent on their family for emotional and material support, but at the same time they're trying to be independent. So there's like a mismatch there. So needing their family still is a source of stress. 5 major things that cause conflicts amongst teens and parents are social life and customs, responsibility, school, family relationships, values, and morals. So 3 major sources of psychological stress and well-being. So basically, if you have them, you're good, and if you don't, you're not so good. Communication, social support, trust, and autonomy. So adolescent and parent relationships are really complex, and Davis identified 5 main structural factors associated with conflict. The rapid rate of sociocultural change, so this creates a generational gap. Differing rates of socialization, so parents retaining their old values and resisting change, it creates like a cultural lag. Physiological differences, so young generation reaches puberty and parents start physically declining, so they're both going through tough adjustments. Psychosocial differences, so adults are more conservative and adolescents seek change. Then there's problems in peer relations. So social networks of peers provide a sense of belonging, identity, intimacy, and companionship. Peer interaction provides opportunities for learning mutuality and reciprocity. And since peer support depends on these 2 things, fear of social rejection and isolation is like embedded in these relationships. We're just scared that people are going to leave us, and we don't want that. So American adolescents are more subjected to peer pressure in order to keep these relationships intact. Problems in school. School is equivalent of like adult employment, so it's probably the most important place outside of the home. Your friends are there, sports are there, competition's there, everything's there. So if everything goes well in school, you're in a good place, you love school, but if things aren't, then school is like the worst place. And then at the end, there was some cross cultural comparisons and analysis. So Japan has the longest school year. They go 240 days out of the year, including Saturdays. And the time spent in school and the pressure to succeed is higher in Japan than the US because of that. Japan's dropout rate is 3%, the US is 12%. And then, interestingly, even though Japan has higher suicide rates in adults, in adolescents it's only 9%, and in the US, adolescence is 13%. Japan focuses less on analytical reasoning and original slash imaginative thinking, so that's like a downfall. And basically, it's just talking about how sociocultural factors shape systems of knowledge, economy, and socialization. So there's no good or bad, it's just different. And that pretty much wraps up chapter 10.